Science is predicated on there being one reality. The one reality hypothesis leaves open the possibility of there being many universes, but regardless, the entire formulation encompasses a single framework. The hypothesis concerning the possibility of many universes is not presented as several distinct theories. Indeed, the multiverse theory is offered as a way to justify the one reality hypothesis, ORH. The ORH is invariably a secular idea posited in an attempt to negate the need for what is referred to as the God hypothesis. The assumption appears to be that if we approach every problem or question with the response that God did it, science will be emasculated. The Bible is not composed of that single phrase, so why do non-Christians think the response of Christians to issues will be of this caliber? History certainly gives us no evidence that this is what happens when we believe in God. But we do not need to invoke God to perceive a difficulty with the ORH. The entire premise of this hypothesis is that all reality has a single origin, and this source is intrinsic to reality itself. That is, the source and the phenomenon are of the same substance and category of thing. This is logically incoherent. In any cause and effect scenario, the cause and effect are always separated by an existential barrier. The two things are always divided, possessing unique identities. The philosophical dog could play catch the tail, by claiming previous realities and new time flows existed, but this is just word games and mind games, for no matter how many realities one attaches to this one, they are all part of the same reality. By claiming there was some other reality that preceded this is to just complicate matters without solving the problem, because there is always a reality whose origin requires an explanation. Normies mock Christians for believing in God because God, they claim, is supernatural. What is a reality that authors its own creation? One would at least have to demonstrate reality is natural, to posit something that is of a different substance. Is an author supernatural when he writes a story? To argue God is supernatural is to put this reality at the center and put God as something to be compared to and evaluated in terms of this thing called reality. But the author is not a product of his story. Reality is profane if not from God and sacred if from God. Interestingly, Christians are called upon to separate. We are also said to be a people set apart. Christians die to this flesh and the world of the flesh to be reborn. Regardless of how normies mock the idea, their reaction is predicated upon there being only one reality. Already we have shown this position to be on shaky ground. However, the ORH idea has many other repercussions, not the least is that those who profess this position lose all capacity for morality. Those who subscribe to a physical reality are able to manage an ethical position. However, we need to distinguish clearly between morality and ethics, something not always done. Ethics is founded on law and a regulatory authority. Morality is grounded in logic. It encompasses or reflects the same elements as arithmetic. Christians are right that morality only comes from God, but if it is provided as ethical strictures, it cannot be followed, nor will it be followed. This is what Israel modeled for us, the inability of man to be a moral creature by the ethical route. However, ethics is all those in physical reality have. Atheists never tire of pointing out that their world is causal. They brag that everything they think is true because it can be attributed to a prior causative factor. What they fail to appreciate is how this locks them into an intolerable worldview. Regardless how benign the application, the causal world is, at the human level, dictatorial and erratic. This has been moderated somewhat by the way the law is enacted and enforced, but laws can always be changed, and if the authorities have concentrated power sufficiently, the laws can also be ignored. If everything is contained in the one reality, then humans are nothing more than complex rock. Theoretically, the same factors that explain the emergence of rock ought to explain the emergence of man. What we cannot have is unique elements that pertain only to man and not to any of the things that compose him. This is a far more serious problem than most anthropologists want to admit. Evolutionists and others can assert with as much finality as they choose, that man is an animal that emerged along with every other life form, from the ooze, but the techniques and methodologies used to deal with the lower forms, do not work on humans, not to any level that makes them useful. Does no one notice that defining animals and plants by a few physical characteristics works well and is the fact that upholds the taxonomic system? But this process fails miserably when we get to humans. Man has a physical appearance, but there is nothing about this appearance that defines us. It is a vehicle we use, but it does not define us, any more than our clothes or car define us. But if we are just physical creatures, how do we deal with the issue of our definition, and if we cannot even define who we are, what of the humanities? How do we study man if all we are permitted to look at is his physical factors? But this situation is what adhering to the one reality hypothesis commits us to. So, we have seen that the ORH is contradictory. It claims to encompass everything whilst adamantly rejecting the supernatural and absolute realms. It denies the possibility of absolutes while tacitly claiming it is an absolute as it purports to encompass all possibilities. The ORH is also inadequate as it excludes the most fundamental and significant features of man. As such, it fails miserably in providing us with a platform on which to analyze and explain human behavior. The ORH is also a cover for the deification of man. The ORH is predicated on the desire for fame, power and wealth, all that leads to the worship of those who attain the highest levels of wealth, power and fame. The ORH is relativistic, dependent on induction and a posteriori thinking used to get at a partial and easily challenged truth. But as the best truth the one reality hypothesis can muster is relativistic, doubt is enshrined in every argument and in every demonstration and evidence pool. Doubt is indeed pervasive and often paralyzing. However, the real problem associated with the ORH is that it eliminates all possibility of its own existence. Cause and effect cannot share the same space and time. There must be a prior and later. There must be two spaces adjacent but not coextensive. The only way the ORH is plausible is if there are two realities and the one causes the other, which totally alienates the precepts of the ORH. But we are not done there. Even though the ORH must be caused to come into existence and cannot be, by its own arguments, the argument remains to explain everything that occurs in the ORH. The ORH does not allow for novel explanations or features to intrude. All that is at the end must be there at the start, at least in potentiality or as a direct result of the workings out of that which was there at the beginning. This may be a reasonable way to analyze nature, but it creates a substantial set of problems when we are dealing with humanity. Humanity, we can posit, is not physical, and therefore the law of nature is not a reasonable set of ideas to apply to mankind. The law of nature is another way of referring to the law of the jungle, which translates into, might makes right and the end justifies the means. In a relativistic universe there is no objective right and wrong. There is no metric by which an action can be evaluated other than it contributes to the desired end. And so the mind of man is given over to conceiving of ways to gain an advantage. Groups are formed, not for a higher purpose but for the leverage it gives its members. The objective is always to gain an advantage and to be in a position where one can destroy what the opposition has, faster and more extensively than they can destroy what you have. All of this follows from and is the result of the one reality hypothesis. In other words, this reality is not just one of many possible realities that could have arisen, it is predicated on the initial assumption, i.e., that reality is physical and of all one substance. We have already remarked that the ORH predicts that there are no other possible realities than the one physical one. Indeed, it makes clear that the one reality that cannot exist is the reality that contains God, as a supernatural being. There are no supernatural things allowed in this conception of reality. We also pointed out that this poses something of a problem, because if there are no absolutes in a reality that is physical, how is it that physical reality is said to be the only possible existing thing? That is an absolute. Either absolutes are possible and physical reality contains that which is not physical, which negates its premise, or absolutes exist and there are two realities. However, if there are two realities, the relativistic one with the contingent truths, and an absolute reality with logical and moral absolutes, then there are two races, because no one can live in two realities, and we know both are inhabited. It is the inhabitation that makes the realities real. A reality is of necessity a viewpoint, a frame of reference for a conscious or sentient being. There being two realities is a way of saying there are two types of consciousness and thus two different ways of seeing reality. But the vision is the reality because everything is ultimately a sentient perspective. There is no outside of the mind. There is only the consciousness of life. Ask how we are made conscious of reality is to miss the point, the consciousness is reality. We are not conscious of the reality of others, because it is ultimately the one consciousness that we partake of. God created something for us to be conscious of, which is our consciousness because what we are aware of is our awareness, or our position and perspective in the consciousness that is reality. So, truth is absolute because consciousness is absolute. We can only be aware. We cannot create what we are aware of. Thus, what we need to do is fix our awareness. We must clarify our consciousness. We must struggle like infants to become conscious. This is called gaining spiritual maturity. When the Bible tells us to fix the stake in our own eye, this is not mere spirituality or a way to modify behavior. This teaching is fundamental and perhaps the most crucial teaching in the Bible. We cannot be saved without adopting this position. We cannot mature. Even the most secular of persons must adopt this position if they are to become fully human, yet so many cultures and peoples reject the notion that the primary problem is their own consciousness level. People are spiritually immature and cannot address the problem that is their own failure to grow up, spiritually. We all mature physically but many never grow up spiritually. Many never gain the ability to look at their consciousness and see how animalistic and primitive it is. Many grow up but remain locked in the consciousness of a child. The point here is that the two-reality hypothesis gives us a reality in which we are given room to develop our consciousness, we can grow and mature spiritually. This option is missing in the ORH. If the world is natural, then we can only prove the validity of our position by imposing it on others. We are forced into conflict. There is no point in looking at our motives or methods if they suffice to give us a win. This is what other cultures hate about whites, we win too often. But as a race we have learned to look inwards more than outwards, we are, in a word, introspective. Other races are less so. But there was no reason for people who fail to look at their own methodologies or ways of thinking as stemming from a personal failure to look inwards, because the only measure of success, in a physical world, is martial victory, both on the individual and organizational level. The only true option we have is to fix ourselves. The ORH and its accent on a physical world, pushes the attention of its adherents outwards, onto others. We are, in a physical reality, either a cause or turned into an effect. This is why people hate whites, they think we turn them into an effect to our cause, but in fact we are focused on personal development and improvement, at a greater rate than other races. This is a generalization but logically it cannot be wrong, because economic progress requires people able to fix their thinking. All progress comes from one person understanding everyone else is wrong. But they are not trying to fix how others think, they are focused on expanding their own consciousness. They are looking at how they think and perceiving the errors in their own thought patterns. Innovators do take clues from others and their society, but the majority of their effort is spent in developing their minds and the level of their understanding. To do this they need to have faith. They need to believe that good ideas have more power than bad ones. But also, their personality needs to favor a reality that is cerebral and conceptual, more than physical. They need to imagine a reality in which ideas matter more than physical ability. This does not mean those who have an intellectual advantage are heirs to a developed theory of reality, it is just that they are predisposed to prioritize the conceptual over the physical. The innovator naturally gravitates towards the spiritual realm over the profane one. In short, those who believe only in physicality must fail when compared to those who gravitate more to spiritual things. Force only gets us so far and ultimately creates a reality that does not make sense. However, When one realizes the ORH is a contradiction and inherently oxymoronic, one is no longer content to live in physical reality, one must transcend to the spiritual one. This is the leap of faith mentioned in Scripture. The ORH fails because ultimately it is destroyed by truth.